KURV, Talkback, Dr. Gelman, home of the IR microphone, where we're here to educate, streaming live on KURV.com, and we're discussing issues as they relate to their historical perspective in the United States based upon the founding principles of the nation, which have been ground into dust by the ruling class of politicians. The big issue lately has been this issue about guns because of the events that have occurred recently in Newtown, Connecticut, and other places, in which the government wishes to take advantage of the situation by stripping the American people of their gun rights. But let's take a look at the origins of these gun rights. The issue of guns and militia appear in two different places in the Constitution. One, it appears in the Articles of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, where it delineates how the federal government can utilize the state militias in order to for national emergencies. And in such instances, the government is required to arm and train the individuals. However, the right to bear arms exists in another part of the Constitution, which is the Bill of Rights. And in the Bill of Rights, it says a well-regulated militia, in order to maintain a free state, in order that the right to bear arms of the citizens shall not be infringed. And what is the distinction between the Bill of Rights and the Articles in the Constitution? The Articles in the Constitution delineate the relationship between the states, essentially between the states and the federal government. And so, therefore, discussion of militia there is in regards to how the states relate to the federal government, and the utilization of the militia may be in times of national emergency. The Bill of Rights delineates the relationship between the government and the people. The Bill of Rights exists to protect the people from their government, and so, therefore, the right to bear arms is required in the Constitution to create a protection of the people from the government. So it is completely absurd to think, as our commentators and so many in the government seem to want to relate, it's completely absurd to think that the Founding Fathers would have created a protection for the people and then given the control over that protection to the federal government, the very entity that the Bill of Rights was supposed to protect the people from. And so, therefore, the Bill of Rights is not an issue about gun rights in regards to hunting or recreational activities. It specifically exists to protect the American people from its own government. So, now their debate is, well, okay, the federal government says for now that you may own guns, but that there will be restrictions as to their potency, whether they're automatic, semi-automatic, the amount of cartridges that can be held in a magazine, and things along those lines. But if, as we have asserted, the Bill of Rights exists to protect the American people from the American government, then therefore it would not have made any sense for the Founding Fathers to have put in a stipulation or stipulated or implicitly stipulated that there would be a limitation as to what kind of potency the weapons could have. That would make no sense whatsoever. Since the Bill of Rights is to protect the American people from its own government, there's no way that the Founding Fathers would have limited the kinds of weapons that the individuals would have had unless simultaneously limited the kind of weapons that the government could have. It would have made no sense to restrict the ability of the people to defend themselves against the government. And so the entire argument that is being used by the government and the media, which is nothing but an arm of the government, and the system of education, which is just the propaganda arm of and indoctrinating arm of the government, they simply are using the events, recent events, to give an excuse to justify the confiscation of weapons from the people, not to protect the people, but to protect the government from the people. And it's very important that the American people understand that. Thomas Paine, the writer of Common Sense, has a quote that says that arms discourage invaders and plunderers, and that is what arms are for. Let's take a look at the American Revolution. The American Revolution, unlike what many of us are taught to believe, did not begin with the Declaration of Independence being pronounced on July 7th of 1776. In fact, the Revolutionary War began in April of 1775, more than 1 year prior to the Declaration of Independence, at the Battle of Lexington and Concord. And the Battle of Lexington and Concord took place when the colonists confronted the English army, and not over philosophical issues of the Stamp Act or taxation without representation or tax on tea or any of the other things that we are familiar with as excuses for the disaffectation of the American people as regards the British aristocracy and the King of England. It was the intent of the British to confiscate the munitions and the weapons of the American people that led to the confrontation. It was when the American colonists were informed that the British were coming to confiscate their weapons and take away their bullets and their guns. It was at that point that the American people drew the line in the sand, and that is what resulted in the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Bunker Hill, which was a major battle, occurred nearly a year before the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Paine, great philosophical essay on the structure of government and the relationship of government to people and the historical relationship and the canard of the divine right of kings, in which the American colonists were urged to overthrow. That great essay written by Thomas Paine was written in January of 1776, a full 6 months before the Declaration of Independence. So despite what people are telling you in the system of education, the media, which misleads us, is that the actual policy of the English, which ignited the Revolutionary War, was the attempt of the British to confiscate the weapons of the American colonists. The Revolutionary War was fought not as one would believe. It wasn't a war between two standing armies, the Continental Army and the British Army. The war was primarily a war between American guerrillas, irregular forces that would basically attack the British whenever they left the urban centers and go into the countryside. The British had a great deal of problem as far as maintaining their supply trains, and they had absolutely zero effect in the countryside. The British were essentially confined to large urban centers such as Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, where they could concentrate their forces. But once those forces moved into the countryside, they were pretty much slaughtered by the American colonist marksmen, who were well used to using guerrilla-type tactics as far in warfare. Eventually, through attrition, the British just gave up because they could not subdue the American people, and therefore the American people achieved their independence. But let's not be misled that the vast majority of Americans agreed with what had happened when the Americans ousted the British from the colonies. 100,000 or more in New York City got up and moved to Canada. So the many citizens of New York said, we would prefer to be servants of a king than to be free. And so even people who are given the option to be free, let alone having to fight to be free, will often prefer to be slaves. And that is something about human psychology that we really do need to understand when we're discussing politics and policy and the way things are in the United States today. We must remember that there's a great number of people, millions, tens of millions of Americans, who prefer to live in dependency, who prefer to have the government take care of them. This is what the government wants of its people. The government wants to create an environment of dependency where the government controls the lives of the people. That's what all governments want. That's what all politicians want. And that is the reason the politicians want to confiscate the weapons from the United States citizens, not to protect the American citizen, but to protect the government. Whenever a dictatorship takes control of any nation, one of the first things that they do is to confiscate weapons. And why did they do that? To protect the citizen? Of course not. They do that in order to protect the government. And that is the goal of all governments, to create a population dependent upon government and to make sure that the people are impotent psychologically and physically from doing any harm towards the government. That's the way it is in every other nation, and that's the way it is in the United States, and that's the way it is in the United States today. Now, unfortunately, we have no great defenders of the American philosophy or ideology in the government today, whether it be Republican or Democrat. They're all essentially big government politicians. And which takes us to the discussion on the system of checks and balances. What is the system of checks and balances? It was a system devised by our founding fathers to protect the American people from an autocratic government. Gridlock is defined when the different components of government, which must act in concert for legislation to be enacted, are incapable of coming to a mutual agreement. This is portrayed by the political class and the media as evidence of a dysfunctional government. Yet the system the founding fathers created is structured as one of checks and balances, where each branch of government can block the actions of another. It is only in autocratic regimes where gridlock is absent. The overt tyrannies of aristocracies and dictatorships lack any checks to the autocratic application of power. The founding fathers considered such a system illegitimate and therefore created a different type of system of governance specifically to prevent such a mechanism of autocratic activity. As the due process associated with a system of checks and balances is generally considered the legitimate form of governance, dictatorships, such as those nations with fascist or communist systems, wish to give an appearance of legitimacy through a structure seemingly incorporating the philosophy of checks and balances. The Nazi fascist system had a Congress, which is called the Reichstag, the judiciary, and an executive branch with a chancellor. The Soviet communists had a Congress they called the Politburo, a judiciary and executive branch with a prime minister. Both systems had some semblance of an electoral process. This is mere pretense, as these systems functioned as monolithic autocracies. Their leaders, Hitler and in the Nazi fascist system, and Lenin, Stalin, and all the rest in the Soviet system, were directly responsible for all those appointed or elected to every position in each branch, effectively creating a monolithic form of government. This is a very commonly applied mechanism of governance, even at the local level, as was noted in a good case in Chicago during the regime of Mayor Richard J. Daley from the years 1955 to 1976, when he died in office. The power, technically, was in the hands of the supposedly independently elected members of the city council, but as the Chicago political machine guaranteed that only pro-Daley politicians were elected, the real power was in the hands of Richard Daley. Such political systems of superficial checks and balances are a charade in a cynical attempt to conceal the ongoing collusion among the branches functioning in effect as an autocracy. They are as authoritarian as the overt dictatorships. In the United States, the Constitution structures an authentic system of checks and balances among its branches. Each individual member is assumed to be independent of any other, elected or appointed for individual quality from the bottom up through society rather than directed from the top down. It is a system based on the principle of individualism rather than statism. Each branch has been given power through the Constitution, but also the means to block the power of every other branch. Even within each branch, the mechanism of function is geared towards gridlock. The Senate and the House can be blocked internally if the members are in disagreement. Even if an agreement is reached in a single house, one house can block another. If both houses are in agreement, the president can veto legislation. Even if all three are in agreement, the federal judiciary can affect how the legislation is implemented. Then all branches are under the control of the people, and the entire nation is limited by the guidelines of the Constitution. Now, much negative commentary is made of this cumbersome method of governance by the useful dupes in media concerned over the impediments to governance by this system, giving a negative connotation to the term gridlock. However, rather than gridlock being the unintended consequence of the system, as is perceived by many, it is the purposeful intent of the Founding Fathers as a means to properly limit government. The founding ideology was of a federal government with very limited power. Federal legislation was to be difficult in achieving and infrequent. Nothing at all resembling the legislative printing press machine inundating the nation with reams of rules and regulations, all empowering the government and reducing individual rights. Each branch was expected to jealously guard its powers and prevent any other branch from any encroachment of the functions of another branch and from acting in a manner outside constitutional guidelines. The advent of the unconstitutional party system sounded the death knell of any system of governance based on individual liberty, freedom, and independence. The system of checks and balances remains superficially in place, but the loyalty of those in government shifts from the people and the Constitution to the party. Though the existence of two major parties vying for control characterizes the system today, technically, as non-monolithic, the common purpose of all politicians to authoritarian rule makes the distinction irrelevant. The party members in each branch act in concert with their compatriots in the other branches. In the party system, issues of constitutionality and the principles of founding ideology are lost in the efforts of each party to achieve the goal of control for its own sake. In fact, the maintenance of a party's control over the reins of the state and the desire of the party out of power to ascend to power requires those belonging to each party to act in a manner contrary to the founding ideology of individual liberty and independence, and instead to act in collusion regardless of the branch they happen to populate. There develops a common thread of purpose among those like-minded members. The party members in each branch act in concert with their compatriots in the other branches, transcending and erasing the separation of powers in the name of party unity, thus nullifying the system of checks and balances. The ascension to power becomes the goal overriding any constitutional restrictions. As the achievement to power is attained through subversion of constitutional restraints on power, the exertion of government power, once accomplished, continues the same method of unconstitutionality. Since only the Constitution provides the bulwark preventing the natural inclinations of the political class from authoritarian rule, and the Constitution is breached in the ascension to power, this functioning outside the Constitution becomes habitual. The government then behaves in the same manner as the overt tyrannies of dictatorships, fascism, and communism. The intent of the nation's founders has been purposefully perverted through the subversion of the Constitution to where today each branch willingly allows the usurpation of power and acts in concert with every other branch to justify the unconstitutional activities of the party and ultimately government. Enslavement of the population and authoritarian rule are the natural goals of the political class, and with the loss of constitutional constraints, this is achieved. So corrupted has the thinking of the nation become that this perversion of constitutional intent is lauded. Therefore, we must realize what exactly is going on in the government today. The first thing is that the government, as we alluded to earlier, wishes to confiscate the weapons of the American people to protect the government from the American people. Then the intent of the structure of government, which was to promote gridlock, to prevent or reduce the amount of legislation, and the legislation had to be confined to the restraints and the constraints placed upon politicians, the bureaucracy, and the government through the Constitution, have all been erased through the party system. Now, when we start talking about death and people being killed and all of the rest, and the horrendous events that occurred where 20-some children and others were murdered by a deranged individual in Connecticut. At the same time, we have a news release which says that Planned Parenthood has reached an all-time level of profitability through the murdering of an all-time high number of innocent, undelivered children. Planned Parenthood has reached an all-time high in the murder of undelivered children and killing almost 350,000 undelivered innocent babies in the year 2012. They made a big deal about this is because their profitability as a consequence of the number of murders of innocent children is also an all-time high. The abortion of pregnancy process, which resulted in the abortion of life of 350,000 innocent undelivered children, netted the Planned Parenthood $500 million, which was more than 40% of the total collections. Now, if you think that the other collections for Planned Parenthood came from some other services provided, you would be mistaken. The rest of the money that Planned Parenthood gets are direct subsidy from the federal government and so-called charitable contributions from the benighted individuals who believe that killing of undelivered innocent children is a good thing. So where is the outcry in the media, in the press, in the system of public education, and in the government? You kill 20 innocent children in a school, and you want to destroy the Constitution based upon that event, and yet we have 350,000 undelivered innocent infants that have been slaughtered for the profitability of an organization founded by fascists and racists. I think it shows you how far we have strayed from the path of the founding of the nation and the ideology of the founding fathers. We in the United States today, 3 million people die every year from one cause or another. That means that 250,000 Americans die on a monthly basis, or nearly 10,000 every day, which is quite an interesting figure. And so, when you think about the events that the media portrays with the death here and a death there, or even 20 deaths, not to belittle it, of course, but the fact of the matter is that on a given day in the United States, 10,000 people die. 20 children is a horrific, 20 children murdered by a deranged individual is obviously a horrific event. But what about all the other thousands upon thousands of people who die in the United States? Why is it that the media only focuses on certain of those, and why is it that all the media, regardless of the channel or the form of media, whether it is radio, television, or print, and regardless which newspaper, regardless which radio station, regardless which TV station, they are all talking about the same stories. Now, if that doesn't illustrate that there's some kind of collusion, that there's some kind of manipulation going on, I don't know what else does. But another issue is we have this deal where we're comparing the United States with other nations as far as gun mortality and all that. And there's a deal that the United States has more guns. As soon as the United States have more guns, and there's more gun murders in the United States than anywhere else, than any other nation. Well, I'm not sure if that's true or not, but and they always bring up the number of murders in I guess we have to go to a break. 7 at KRV, Talkback, Dr. Lawrence Gelman, back after this short commercial break. We're back. 7 at KRV, Talkback, Dr. Lawrence Gelman, over the air microphone. Just a little bit more on the gun issue, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the Republicans. And just I was listening on Fox News there, the idiocy of the Republicans. There's this issue about gun murders in England, and most of the European countries pretty much lie about their things, about their stuff. But there are a couple of facts that are brought out. One is that the European Union has declared that the United Kingdom is the most violent nation in Europe, and that violent crimes in England are 10 times the rate in the United States. That's kind of an amazing fact that's completely avoided, isn't it? And also, last year there were 10,000 crimes committed with the use of a handgun, which is kind of interesting, and that's in the United Kingdom, since they have a complete ban on weapons. In the United Kingdom, they have 4,000 acts of violence, which are reported, and there's probably a great deal more than that, because there's no point in reporting acts of violence in any of the UK countries, because they don't do anything about it. Rape is essentially considered a misdemeanor in those countries. Anyway, in the United Kingdom, there are 4,000 acts of violence every year per 100,000 population. Compare that to the United States, where there's only about 440 acts of violence for every 100,000 people in the country. Now, let's go on to the Republicans. Now, the Republicans caved in like the cowards that they are. And the reason that they're cowards is because they're unprincipled. They don't believe in the Constitution any more than the Democrats do, or any more than any other politician. And so, therefore, they cannot present an adequate conservative defense against the Democrats' fascist type system, because the Republicans are unprincipled. Now let's look at the trap that they're falling into with this reduction of spending. Exactly how do they expect to gain any kind of traction demanding that spending be reduced? Spending can be reduced and must be reduced, but the way it's going to be presented, I can assure you, is this. What's going to happen is that the Democrats are going to say that the Republicans are cutting essential programs that are necessary for individuals to stay alive, with health care, food stamps, or welfare, and the other handouts the government does to the parasites in the country. And is actually going to use the same argument they've always used in order to preserve the wealth, so to speak, of those making, I guess, $400,000 a year and above now, that they are willing to sacrifice the well-being of the middle class or the poor American. The Democrats are going to say what needs to be done is not cutting the spending of essential programs, but actually to increase taxation. That is exactly what's going to happen, and the Republicans are going to cave like they always do. The Republicans, what they don't understand is that there is a way to cut spending properly, which would actually increase the benefits to the American people. You cannot just cut spending across the board as through with a meat cleaver. You cannot do that. You have to use a surgical scalpel. There's a lot of misappropriated, I think is the word, monies. Waste is not the right word, because that implies that it is unintentional, that money is spent poorly because of bad management, because of bad decision making, and that it is not really intentional. But the misappropriation of money is intentional. You need to understand that the American government misappropriates money in order to funnel wherewithal to the friends, relatives, cronies, and contributors of politicians. And the only way to cut spending without cutting essential services is to reduce the amount of money going to the unnecessary individuals who receive huge amounts, vast amounts of misappropriated funds. That will not happen, because the misappropriated funds are not doled out willy-nilly. They are doled out specifically to those who benefit government. So therefore, in order to cut spending properly, you would have to cut the amounts of money going to the friends, relatives, cronies, and contributors of politicians. That is not going to happen. All that will happen is they'll threaten to cut essential services to scare the people, to justify the continued misappropriation of funds to the cohorts of the politicians, and secondarily to increase the taxes upon anyone who produces, ostensibly to reduce the budget deficit, but in reality to eliminate the independent class of American citizens. It's so hard to get across what actually is going on in the world today, because, or at least in the world or the United States, because of the vast amount of misinformation that we are inundated with, whether it's in the system of public education, or whether it's whatever other, whether it's through the media, the system of public education, or through the government, we are inundated with propaganda. And this propaganda makes it almost impossible to get to the facts, because we're just sludged through with mired down in propaganda and lies. Let's talk about the Civil War a little bit, and to show you the vast amount of misinformation that we have in this world today, the vast amount of misinformation, specifically in order to indoctrinate the people to believe something which is simply not true. And let's take a look at the Civil War, and let's take a look at what we are led to believe and what is the actual truth of the Civil War. The Civil War was instigated by Abraham Lincoln, not to preserve the Constitution, but to subvert its tenets and to create a fascist superstate with an all-powerful central government, because it was his personal belief that this was a superior method of governance. This way of thinking was no different from the age-old corrupt philosophy of aristocrats and kings who fully believed that a single head and a small group of elite cohorts to be served by a controlled population was the best way to manage a country. It was the very same rationale that Adolf Hitler espoused in Mein Kampf to bring the independent states of Germanic-speaking peoples under one government. Now, many would be shocked to learn that the first attempt at the passage of the 13th Amendment was actually in 1861. The 13th Amendment is the one that prohibited slavery as an institution in the United States. And that's what most Americans are aware of. However, and that was passed in 1865, I think. But many would be surprised to learn that the first attempt at the passage of a 13th Amendment had passed both the House on February 28, 1861, and the Senate on March 2, 1861. This is before the Civil War. The bill that passed the Senate in March 2nd of 1861 was just 2 days before Lincoln's inauguration, and it passed with a necessary 2/3 majority and was fully supported by Lincoln and was well onto its certain ratification by the states when its passage was interrupted by the start of the Civil War. Now let's see what the 13th Amendment that was passed, the original 13th Amendment, what it said. It said, "No amendment shall be made to the Constitution which will authorize or give to Congress the power to abolish or interfere within any state with the domestic institutions thereof, including that of persons held to labor or service by the laws of such state," thus protecting the institution of slavery. Then Lincoln, in his inaugural address, confirming his support, said, "I understand a proposed amendment to the Constitution, which amendment, however, I have not seen," which he's lying about that, "has passed Congress to the effect that the federal government shall never interfere with the domestic institutions of the states, including that of persons held to service. To avoid misconstruction of what I have said, I depart from my purpose not to speak of particular amendments, so far as to say that, holding such a provision to now be implied constitutional law, I have no objection to its being express and irrevocable," expressing complete support of an amendment which was going to solidify the institution of slavery. Lincoln had received less than 40% of the popular vote in the election, and the nation was splitting along sectional lines, not only North versus South, but also East versus West. An unpopular president with fascist inclinations had attempted to preserve the increasingly centrally dominated Union through conciliation. If, as has been repeated ad infinitum, that the desire for secession by the southern states was a consequence of Lincoln's intent to abolish slavery, then why proceed once Lincoln had assured that slavery would not be abolished but preserved? The issue of slavery was obviously not the determining or apparently even a significant factor in the decision of the southern states to secede. The southern states were simply exasperated with northern domination of American policy, which consistently had placed the southern states at an economic disadvantage and had opted to secede, as was their constitutional right from the Union. Lincoln, faced with the failure of a tactic of conciliation, made an about-face, not because of any change in conscience, but as a necessary change in tactics to achieve central power authority over an increasingly fractious and independent-minded people. On his own volition, with the aid of a few cohorts, Lincoln unilaterally and without a declaration of war by the Congress launched an assault against the Confederate States. He used as justification the evils of slavery and the contrived belligerence of the South. His only aspiration was to establish an autocratic regime over a nation of subservient states dependent upon the federal government. This is what he all along wanted, as well with a few other autocrats in the government. And they finally achieved their result through the unconstitutional Civil War. Once the war ended and the Confederate States subjugated to central authority, Lincoln institutionalized by means of the amendment process absolute subservience, not merely of the Confederate States, but of all the states. Even after Lincoln's death, his legacy marched forward. And another aside on the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation written or declared in January of 1863 was a federal, was not legislation. It was simply a proclamation by Lincoln saying that slavery was going to be outlawed in the Confederate States. But there's a couple of things here of some interest. First, why did Lincoln wait until 1863, when the war began in 1861, to declare the emancipation of the slaves, if that was the sole purpose, or that was the major purpose of the Civil War initiating? But that's because it wasn't the major purpose at all. The only reason that Lincoln declared the emancipation of the slaves was that the North was being hard-pressed at the time by Southern forces, and he used it as part of a military strategy, hoping that the slaves would rise up in the South and create a second front against the Confederate forces. This, of course, never happened because slaves being what they are, they preferred to be slaves. And so they did absolutely nothing. The other thing interesting in the Emancipation Proclamation is that it only referred to Confederate states. There were states in the country, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, Missouri, 4 states at least, which were not part of the Confederacy, but still had slavery legalized in those states. But in the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln made no mention of the emancipation of slaves in those states. Clearly, Lincoln's goal was not based on some kind of conscience where an opposition to slavery, and therefore a blanket statement of a philosophical intent to eliminate slavery in all states. It was simply a military tactic which failed. And so I think that casts the true light of what Lincoln was up to. He was a fascist, and he wanted to create a fascist nation, and that is what he succeeded in doing. Why? Because Lincoln was an ambitious politician, and politicians all want to impose their views upon others. That is fascism. And Lincoln, being a particularly ambitious politician, held those views even more tightly than other politicians might. He believed in a strong central government and did not believe that the states ought to have independence whatsoever. For Lincoln, the fact that the southern states seceded only solidified his belief that the states should be subservient to a central government, because that the states were overly independent was to him evidenced by their desire to secede. That proved to Lincoln that the states were too independent and they needed to be brought under greater control so that such an event could never happen again. That brings us to the idea of secession today. What purpose is a geographical area? Why is the United States particularly sacred? And if it is, does that mean that Canada is less sacred? Mexico is less sacred? And why is the sacredness confined to a particular contiguous group of states? And in fact, it is not anymore, is it, a contiguous group of states, because with Hawaii, which is out in the Pacific somewhere, is certainly not contiguous to any other state, and Alaska, I believe, is also not contiguous either. And so therefore, there is something amiss here that makes us believe that there's something sacred about this union of states. After all, the colonies were 13 in the beginning, and if there was something sacred about the 13 colonies, then there would not have been an increase in the number of colonies or an increase in the number of states to where we have 50. So the whole thing is mythology and propaganda and indoctrination in order to justify a central government controlling as many people as possible. And there's nothing new about that. The history of the world is rife with politicians and central government seeking to increase its power authority through invasion and coercion of other countries, of other peoples. That is, war in Europe for 2,000 years and more has been exactly that, with the attempt of one king trying to take the possessions of another king, one aristocrat trying to take the possessions of another aristocrat. And all it is a bunch of gangsters, mobsters, that are trying to increase their power by enslaving other people and stealing what they have. Does anyone out there believe that the central government of the United States and the political class of the United States is somehow of a higher level of integrity than any other government of any other nation? Are we supposed to believe that somehow that the American president has a higher level of morality than the president or the prime minister or the dictator of another country? Of course not. They're all exactly the same. That is why politicians get along so well with each other, because they're all like-minded in their psychology, and they all want to impose their will upon people. Whenever a revolution occurs, the governments of the world are opposed to it, regardless of the ideology of the revolution, because the fear of government is to be overthrown. At the Russian Revolution, initially the Russian by the Western powers and the United States, but it wasn't because of a fear of communism. It was a fear of revolution. And so, Russia had been under Tsarist dictatorship for hundreds of years, and the Western governments became very fearful of the idea of revolution in a country that had been so dominated by a central government authority for so long, because an overthrow of such a government would give a bad example to the peoples of other nations who might decide that they needed to overthrow their governments as well. And so the Western nations were opposed to the Bolsheviks initially because they feared, or at least the Russian Revolution, because they feared this was an example that might spread to their own countries. Once it became apparent that the Bolsheviks and the Soviets were actually more authoritarian than the previous Tsarist regime, you saw a complete change in the attitude of the Western nations. Rather than opposing the Bolsheviks, they actually helped the Bolsheviks survive and strengthen them, leading all the way up through the years to the philosophy created by Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger of détente, which said that the existence of the Soviet Union was permanent and that it was necessary for the Americans to actually work with them for the betterment of all. The intelligentsia of much of the United States, including Nobel Prize-winning economists such as Samuelson and Harvard, actually preached the accolades of the Soviet centralized system as one that all countries should model themselves after. And so once the Western powers it became evident to the Western powers that the Soviet regime was actually more autocratic and more enslaving than the previous Tsarist regime, that's when you saw the attitude change on the part of the Western nations. Too many believed that the West was blind to what was going on and therefore allowed the communists to come into power when there was ample opportunity to prevent them from coming into power. But the fact of the matter is that what the Western countries did was well calculated. They opposed the Bolsheviks when they thought it was a revolution of the people, and then supported the Bolsheviks when it became apparent that it was simply the means of another autocracy enslaving the people. And if you don't believe that, then look what happened in World War II, where the United States went to war specifically to save Stalin and the Soviet Union, and after World War II handed over to the communist Red Chinese, the Maoists in China, handed over hundreds of millions of innocent Chinese into the clutches of the communist thugs in China. There is no way that Mao could have taken over China without the complicity of the United States. Mao was given money, billions of dollars in today's dollars, by the United States government, and all the weapons that China... Where do you suppose Mao got his weapons from? Not from Russia. After all, Russia got their weapons from the United States as well. And Russia could barely afford to maintain itself, let alone support a war in another country. No, all the money and all the weapons that Mao used to defeat the nationalist Chinese under Chiang Kai-shek were given to him by the United States. In the United States publications, books written over China, things like that, all the press in the United States did nothing but give accolades for the communists, whether it was Durante writing for the Pulitzer, or whether it was Edgar Snow giving the high praises of the agrarian reformer, as he referred to as of Mao Zedong. And so governments are all the same. They can call themselves democratic republics, communist, fascist dictatorships, aristocracies, of the elitists that call themselves government officials, bureaucrats, and politicians. And I guess we're out of time, but I think you must have learned something today, because I've never heard it anywhere else before, and that's what this program is all about. Thanks for listening. 7 to KRV, Talkback, Dr. Lawrence Gelman, hold of the iron microphone. Be back next week with more education for our listeners. Thanks for listening.
This is Texas Agriculture Commissioner Todd Staples. Are you traveling across the border for the holidays? Bring back happy memories, but please leave the fruits, vegetables, and plants behind. These items could bring invasive pests into Texas. These pests devour crops, kill citrus trees, and put people out of work. They've cost Texas millions of dollars and can wreak havoc on the environment. Learn more about invasive pests at hungrypest.com. A message from USDA and the Texas Department of Agriculture.
Go Mustangs! It's the annual McAllen Memorial Mustangs Football Banquet this Sunday, January 13th in the Memorial High School Gym at 5:30. $10 admission fee. Parents, fans, alumni, come dine with us and support the McAllen City Champs. Silent auction items, player awards, and highlight videos. Call Ilda at 207-8526 to reserve your spot. Memorial Mustang Football Banquet and Fundraiser this Sunday, 5:30 p.m. All are welcome. Call Ilda at 207-8526. Go Memorial Mustangs. Our legacy continues.
Fair and balanced coverage from Fox News Radio, the most trusted name in news. This is 710 KURB Edinburgh, a station operated by the R Communications
Radio.
Group.
I'm Ron Flatter. More than 120 cities have reported deaths from the flu that's going around. New York's governor declared a statewide public health emergency and adding his name to the list of leaders urging people to get a flu shot.
Officials say supplies are running low in some places, but vaccine is still available. Nearly 130 million doses of flu vaccine have been distributed, and so far at least 112 million have been used. Since the flu epidemic in 2009, vaccination rates have increased here in the United States, but